recording is going fantastic. Gotta get my script back up and we'll just take it from the top and we'll see how it goes. 3, 2, 1. Hello, and welcome to Children of Misery. I haven't posted in a while, and that's because I've spent the better part of this last month preparing videos, and also getting ready to actually run this campaign with my players. But I wanted to make something for the channel and try out a vlog style for certain video topics, so if this is something that you like and you want to see more, let me know in the comments. But I wanted to make a video on how I landed on the tabletop system that I will be using for this campaign setting, and maybe help someone else who's looking into different systems for their own setting. So before we get into that, I just want to say up front, I'm not here to claim that any of these systems are better than the other. They all have their uses. In fact, I really want to highlight the pros and cons of each of the systems that I encountered and kind of give you my take on them and what they're built for and what I think they're good at. All of this is, of course, my own personal opinion and is not to be taken as hard fact. I have a lot of experience in some of these systems and not a lot in others, so you are more than welcome to have your own personal preferences for tabletop RPGs. With all that being said, let's get into what my campaign setting actually is and what I found. Children of Misery is a dark urban fantasy world where all the players are children in this magic industrial city setting. The whole campaign takes place in the same city, and the general vibes that I'm going for is sort of series of unfortunate events meets the Goonies, so that's the lens that I'm going to be viewing all of these different systems through. I'll also be giving each of these kind of a loose rating based on what I've experienced and what I've found on a crunchiness scale. So if you're not familiar with the term crunchy when it comes to RPGs, crunchy just means very rules heavy. So you have creamy RPGs and crunchy RPGs. So what is the range of this scale? A 0 or a 1, I would say, would be a system like Wander Home, which is very narrative focused. There's barely any mechanics. There is a character sheet, but it's more so just as a reference for what you are, who you are. There's no dice rolling whatsoever. There's no stats, there's no health, there's no defense. You're just living your life as a little animal guy with your friends. And then a 10 on the scale, I would say, is something like Phoenix Command or any sort of war game. Phoenix Command is not even really a roleplay game at all. Anything in this category would be very heavy on mechanics and strategy and combat and other scenarios like that. There's a lot of rules, there's a lot of dice rolling, there's a lot of stats to keep track of. Basically a lot of numbers. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is, of course, D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. This is a system that a lot of people are familiar with, and that is because one of its strengths is that it's kind of the OG TTRPG. There's a lot of familiarity with this system, and because of that, there are a lot of resources. So that is a huge strength for anyone who's looking to get into tabletop games to begin with. It's usually the first one that people try and kind of fall in love with. And another really big strength of this system is that the basic rolling mechanics are pretty simple. For the most part, you're just rolling a d20 and adding your stats, unless otherwise specified by your weapon, or if the DM says something, or if you have some sort of mechanic with maybe percentile dice. But for the most part, 90% of the time you're rolling the one dice, the d20. So I like that. I was originally planning to run Children of Misery in this system, but I ran into a few snags because D&D has a lot of pre-existing lore built into it, even without realizing. The further I got into world building for Misery, the more I realized that D&D was not going to cut it. I was having to modify the system more and more the further I got into my writing. Another, I guess, con or weakness of D&D would be that it is genre specific. It is really good for fantasy and certain variants of fantasy. Like, you can modify it, of course, to do anything you like. You could do sci-fi with a D&D setting, but it is built for magic. It is built for that kind of classic high fantasy. Even Spelljammers is kind of a sci-fi, but more of a Treasure Planet sci-fi than a hard sci-fi. Another weakness of the system is that there are a lot of rules to keep track of. I think anyone who's played D&D has been in a situation in their game where they have to stop and look up a rule or some kind of condition, or a weapon stat or anything of that sort. Combat is usually pretty slow because of this, because you have a lot of really cool stuff you can do, but all that cool stuff has mechanics, and it sometimes can take away from the moment at hand. Another reason I didn't go with D&D for my campaign system is that you are kind of locked into your choices as a player. So when you make a D&D character, you are choosing a class, a bard, a cleric, a barbarian. And while yes, you can multi-class and sort of tailor your character that way, there is sort of a set track for you when you pick that class. There's not a lot of deviance unless you do a lot of homebrewing, which is a lot of work. On a crunchiness level, I would give D&D maybe a 7.5 or an 8. It has a lot of good flavor for roleplay, but it also has a lot of rules attached to it. Spinning off of D&D was Pathfinder. I looked into Pathfinder a little bit, considered it. One of the strengths of this system is that it is more customizable than D&D. It shares a history with D&D because it sort of spun off of that onto its own branch. Instead of a locked-in class system, it kind of has this class skill tree system where you can kind of pick and choose what you want along the way. There are still classes, but there's a lot more options. One thing I liked in Pathfinder is that spell casting was a bit simpler. I like the combat system in it as well, but there are some weaknesses that come with this system. It's a little flexible when it comes to genre, but generally it's pretty much good for sci-fi and fantasy. There is Starfinder, which is the sci-fi spinoff, and of course the traditional fantasy setting. But there's also a lot of rules for everything, like in D&D. Every spell, every weapon, everything you do has a stat that you have to keep track of. You have your health, you have your defense. So with all that in mind, I actually rate it slightly higher than D&D. I'd give it like an 8 or an 8.5 out of 10. Pretty close, but I would say it's even a little bit crunchier than D&D. And for Misery, I was looking for something a little more narrative focused. Another one I looked at is called Blades in the Dark. This is a really cool system and I highly recommend everyone check it out. Some of the strengths I found in this system are that it's really good for group mechanics. The team or the party really matters in this system, so not quite as much the individual. It has really cool scenario and character specific mechanics. For example, there are vices that your character indulges in, or there's long-term projects, there are bases, there's session planning while you're doing the heist, which I think is really cool. So if you're pulling a heist as a team, there's sort of this flashback mechanic where if you encounter a problem, you can trigger a flashback to when you were planning the heist and how you overcome that obstacle. However, I also knew that it was not going to be the right system for my setting. While it does lend itself really well to that dark fantasy urban setting, it is very genre specific. It is for thieves, it is for heists, it is for dark urban fantasy, which is my genre, but not quite. Especially with kid protagonists, I don't really want to have them all forced to become thieves. I want everyone to have choices in that sense. And the magic is cool, but it leans more into occult and not really traditional fantasy magic, and I wanted a bit more of that. But it's a pretty easy system to learn, so for crunchiness, I'd give it a 4.5 out of 10. Again, it's really cool, but it wasn't going to work for me. Another cool system I ran into was Kids on Bikes, or Kids on Brooms, or Teens in Space. Those are all three genres of the same system. But some strengths with kids on bikes is that you have kid protagonists with very little power. You're very much helpless in this world. There's all the adults around you, so I really like that aspect of it. Another pro is that it has a very simple rolling system. Basically, if you're rolling a low die, you have a low stat in that. So if you're rolling a d4, you're not going to be as good as if you were rolling a d12. So the higher dice equals the higher stat. With the way the mechanics work out as well, it is always possible for your character to succeed. There's a mechanic for, I think it's called exploding dice, where if you roll the maximum number on your dice, you get to roll it again and add it to the total. So you could, by luck, roll really, really high with a very low numbered dice. So there's always that chance of success, and I like that. I like that there is sort of this luck factor involved with kids. Another thing I liked is that the skills that you gain in the system are very character driven. That works very well for my setting. There's also no HP to track. One less thing to keep track of. Maybe that works for your system, maybe it doesn't, but for me, I kind of liked the idea that I wasn't having to tally that. A sort of weakness I found with it though is that it is kind of genre specific, not in the same way the other systems are, but this does very well with sort of small town supernatural. So kind of like Stranger Things or E.T., and not so much the large scale stuff that I wanted. Both a plus and a weakness, but a weakness for my specific setting is that there's not as many rules. It's very simple to learn, very cool character sheets, easy to pick up, but I think for me and my players, it was going to be too simple. I didn't have enough flexibility when it came to those sort of mechanics. And a third thing is that it's not as robust of a magic system as I wanted. There are spells, they do things, but there's not as many options. I wanted more flexibility, more power, both for my players, but also for myself to make enemies. For crunchiness, I would give Kids on Bikes a 2 out of 10. Again, very easy to learn, super cool system, highly recommend checking it out, but not the one for me. The next one I ran into was Monster of the Week, which is a very fun system. Some of the strengths I found was that there's no HP to track. Not specifically anyway. You have sort of a wound system, and the more you get wounded, the more likely it is you will be incapacitated or die. It has a very easy to follow character sheet. It's basically one page, and a lot of it is character flavor, and I like that a lot. And there's sort of these archetypes that you play into for your character. It has a very easy rolling system. You use a d12 for a lot of this, and that's pretty much it. Don't really need to keep track of a bunch of different dice for a bunch of different weapons. You just do the thing you want to do, and you roll for it. It's really good for sort of a one-shot episodic format, like a TV show with a greater story, so I like that aspect of it. But that also comes as sort of a con with what I want, because I do want a grander story. I do have a larger story planned for my setting. Some of the weaknesses I found with this is that you are sort of locked into your archetype. Similar to D&D, you pick a class, and that is your class. And there are some things that give you some flexibility. I think there's an ability that lets you take something from another class, but overall, pretty much what you get at the beginning is what you're going to be stuck with. It is also genre specific. It is horror, it is mystery. And I like horror mystery, but that's not the main genre that I was looking for my setting. On a crunchiness level, I would give this sort of probably a 3 out of 10. Another one I looked at and toyed with is called Fate, or Fate Core, which is a neat system. It works with any genre. It is not genre specific. That was a huge plus for me because it allows a lot of customization on my end as the person running the game. It is overall more character and narrative focused, which I liked a lot for what I was trying to do. It also has extremely easy rolling mechanics. There are no numbers, but that's where we start to get into the weaknesses of the system, for me specifically. One of which is that it requires custom dice. All of the dice have pluses and minuses on them, and you roll a certain number of them, and you tally them up however many pluses you get, or a minus will cancel out a plus, so your overall result is how well you do at that thing. which is cool, but it would also involve me asking all of my players to get brand new dice that they would probably never use in any other system. Another weakness is that it is more character and narrative focus and there is less mechanics to it. It is not built for war games. It is not built for high strategy, which is, again, not my goal with my setting, but it's a little too light for me. I'd give it a 4 out of 10 on the crunchiness scale. But if you're looking for a system that doesn't involve numbers, if you just don't want to math at all, this is a cool one to check out, and you can customize it to your setting really nicely. And after all of that, I stumbled upon what would be my final choice for my setting. And I ended up going with Savage Worlds. Savage Worlds has a lot of good perks to it. It is also not genre specific. It can work with pretty much anything you throw at it. In fact, it is designed for that. Another big strength is that there is no HP to track, no little numbers to have to constantly add up and subtract. It works on a wound-based system, so if you are wounded, you'll take a penalty on your rolls. If you're wounded again, you'll take a higher penalty. If you take enough wounds, you'll be incapacitated or possibly die. There are some weaknesses with this system though. It is a generic setting, so you are going to get generic rules. But even though they are generic overall and can apply to any setting, there are a decent number of them. There are chase mechanics, there are combat mechanics, there are character interaction mechanics, there are spell mechanics. So even though the rules are generic, I felt that there was enough of them for me to have some control in the game and to make it a little bit more gritty, a little more realistic. It also works with an upgrade system of edges and hindrances, so these are positive and negative traits. Some of them have mechanical advantages, but some of them are purely character-driven and narrative focused, which I love. And it gives players a huge amount of freedom to choose what they want. There is no classes. It is purely character first, and you pick the skills that apply to you. However, the biggest weakness of this system, and one that I will still have to get used to as I'm running this game, is the rolling mechanics. This is by far one of the more complicated rolling mechanics. It's not too bad, but similar to Kids on Bikes, the lower die you have on a skill, the less good you are at it. The higher dice you're rolling on a skill, the better you are at it. But with each of those skill rolls, you are rolling the dice for your skill, and you're also rolling what's called a wild die, which is always a d6. So say you have a skill at a d10. You would be rolling a d10 and a d6, and you would take whichever number is higher. It also has exploding dice mechanics, so if you roll the highest number possible on your dice, you get to roll it again and add it to the total. It's a lot of going back and forth between those two dice for your skill and your wild die and figuring out what the final number is. But once you have the number, it's really not too bad to link it to the skill and make it work. But because of that complex rolling mechanic, it does bring the crunchiness level up a bit. Everything else about this system worked really well for me. It has specific mechanics for homebrewing. If you need a custom fantasy race, you can do that with the rules they've laid out in the setting. But all in all, I would give it a 5 out of 10 on the crunchiness level. I think it is pretty middle of the road if you're looking for that balance between lots of good mechanics for interesting combat, but also more character-driven, less stats focused. So my main point is when trying to find a tabletop system for your specific setting, here are the 3 things that I would ask that you keep in mind. Number 1, you should always try to put the tone and narrative of what you're trying to accomplish first. Is this thing that you're trying to do more combat focused or more narrative focused? Do you want more realism, or do you want kind of more loosey-goosey rules? Are you going for survivalist, or do you want to be more casual with your approach? And what genre are you going for? Are you going for traditional fantasy? Are you going for Western? Are you going for sci-fi? There are certain systems that lend themselves really well to those. If I was running a horror campaign and I wanted to really lean into that, I would run something like Call of Cthulhu, which is designed for that. I didn't end up looking at that at all for my campaign because I was convinced early on I did not want to be hardcore horror. Number 2, think about what's going to be the best experience for you, the person running the game, and for your players playing the game. How much flexibility do you want to give your players as they progress and level up? Do you want them to play into an archetype, or do you want them to have sort of a skill tree available where they can pick and choose what they want and they're not tied down to a specific class? And a very important thing to keep in mind, how much are you willing to keep track of as the game master? As the person running the game, it's your responsibility to know these rules and how to enforce them. If you're going to get overwhelmed by a system, it may not be the right one for you. Or if you think that you're not going to have enough control in a system that has very loose rules, that may not be the right option either. Establish right off the bat what the expectations for you and your players are. Do your players want more combat or do they want more narrative? I've had several conversations with my players. I've also been a player alongside the people I'll be running my game for. So I know their tendencies, I know what they value in a game. And as a group, we tend to be much more narrative focused than mechanic focused. So that was what I wanted to find in my system. And number 3, probably the most important, make sure it's fun. If you're not going to have fun doing it, then it's not the system for you. If your players are not going to have fun doing it, it's not the system for you. And in general, if mechanics or the lack of mechanics in a TTRPG are taking away and preventing you from having fun with your narrative, with what you're trying to accomplish in your setting, then it's probably not a good system for that specific game. So that's how I landed on using Savage Worlds for my campaign setting. If you're still here at the end of the video, I just want to say thanks. I appreciate you. The plan moving forward with this channel is to have alternating weeks between videos and streaming. So we've got this video coming in right now, and next week I will be streaming on Sunday, February 9th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. To stay up to date and help support the channel, please feel free to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that clock tower notification bell to stay informed on what's coming up. I also have a Patreon where you can access all of the high-res art files from all of my videos, as well as some extra goodies that'll be coming along the way. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in misery. Is that good? Is that a good tagline? Should we do that? Let me know in the comments. What's a sad, miserable way that I could sign off on a video without being a total bummer?